Welcome to this week's Informed. Joining me today, we have Mario Beeks, Reuben Humphreys and John Heron. I'm your host, Caroline Council. Now, we're going to talk today about the interest rate hikes and the fact that we've had 10 consecutive hikes, courtesy of the Reserve Bank and Philip Lowe. We're going to be exploring whether Philip Lowe has got it right, whether the Reserve Bank is doing it the right way, whether there are other levers that the bank or the government could be using to basically help the economy along. We've also got Jim Chalmers heading towards his first budget in May, and what will be the impact on that? I think John and I certainly live at the coalface of what occurs when money gets hard to find, hard to earn, and gets eaten up in mortgage repayments. So we've seen an increase in suicide rates. We're probably going to see that get worse before it gets better. And Philip Lowe took a meeting with the head of Suicide Prevention Australia to talk about the impact, the adverse impact, the terrible impact of those increased interest rates. So let's discuss, are they getting it right? Does the government need to do more? Do they need to interfere with the RBA? Do they need other levers to try and help the economy get back to where we want it to be, ideally?
I'll kick off with some basic economic policy. Macro and microeconomics is that we're in a global economy, so the Reserve Bank really doesn't have a choice. It can't sit here while certainly interest rates are a trigger for rampant inflation. We know what's happened with inflation. Whether it has certain impacts on that is another matter. Usually in the past, they were used to dampen the housing market. That was the RBA rhetoric. But let's face it, what are we at? 3.6% now at the RBA cash rate. So that's quite low by other standards. I think it's about 4.5% in New Zealand and Canada, a little bit less in the US. So what happens if you just sit there and don't raise interest rates? Inflation runs out of control, the currency collapses. It's probably mathematically unfortunate that when you come from a regime of 3% mortgage rates to 7% now, that financial impact, I know on the average mortgage is about another $1,200 a month. Okay, so where do people find that $1,200 extra a month is one question, right? But in reality, they're limited in what they can do, and in fact, they haven't gone as far as they potentially could have. So I'll probably just say that with the interest rates.
Well, money was so cheap for so long, and we knew it wasn't going to last forever. So I guess when money's cheap, it's like anything. If it's sitting there in front of you and you can take advantage of it, you do. And you think about tomorrow. You don't necessarily say, well, how affordable is this cheap money if something changes, like the interest rate rises?
Just a quick reminder what I said a few weeks ago on the program, that Australia is a very low capital country. There's not a lot of capital floating around. And on that basis, and it's very heavily geared towards housing and housing lending. The banks are extraordinarily highly geared towards housing lending for a lot of reasons, including capital adequacy. But the thing with that is that all that 70% of that debt is raised in short-term paper, mostly in Asia. So if you don't raise rates, it's not attractive. My visitor. If you don't raise rates, it's not attractive. The market will collapse for that, and you can't fund your housing anyway. So no choice.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. And what Caroline just said, like a few minutes ago. When we go back in 2020, 3 years ago, exactly now time, when the government and RBA told people, go into more expenditure because the money is cheap. And, for me was that very, very moment. It's like, there's no such a thing, money is cheap, because you can't tell people go spend more money. But then we have the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who's going in England simultaneously, say like, we're going to export more tin tums in England. It's like, what nobody taken in consideration, it's a geostrategic position Australia. Australia is a last stop station for the logistics, for the ships, for the planes, for the everything. That's the reason why New Zealand suffered. New Zealand is going to be involved. But what nobody take into consideration that Australia has no heavy industry. We have no tourism for 3 years. Heavy relying on our education and foreign students. So the government now and the government before, they were just gambling with the same things over and over again when they can't do nothing. You can't repeat the history. So I think that John said 3.6 is a low, but I think it's a big for Australia because there's not much cash flowing around. Our logistics is going to be even worse. And I think we're going to see the even worse situation in Australia economically than ever before.
It's also going to make those first home buyers, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to get into the housing market. And once you have that huge divide between the have and the have-nots, there's a whole lot of people that start to suffer and they start to resent, and something has to give in that regard. I mean, we're not even just talking about getting into the housing market. We're talking about people not being able to rent, and looking at the rent prices going up around the country. They can't even get baseline accommodation. And I don't think we want that sort of situation where you have the poor housed out in the boonies, which happens anyway, but you see those huge waves of, if you will, intercity migration, more people on the roads, more congestion, more people spending money on fuel to get to work, for those that actually have to travel for work. So,
another thing, talking about this, we spoke about this, and you, John, you can elaborate more. The problem with the inflation and economical situation, it's not just people have no money to buy the food or pay the bills. There's the other side of their life as well, which is criminal organized crime activities. And as inflation rises, criminal activity is going to increase. It's going to be more and more fraud. It's going to be more and more cybercrime. And, I don't say that Australian police cannot tackle all this, but the amount of people is going to try to be ripped off. And I can see now through my work, people are being ripped off left, right, and center. This is what I'm seeing, that another problem, that the crime rate will rise on all type of the criminal activities as inflation rises.
And that's desperation. That's the net effect of desperation. It's like prime targets, for example, were the people after the bushfires. They were literally picked off by get money quick, get rich quick schemes.
Yes.
And they fall for it because they've lost everything. They're desperate. They think, well, I've got to make up the shortfall. So I think you're obviously right, Mario. That's your bag. That's what you know about. So that's going to play out as well, and badly for people.
Yep, Caroline's absolutely right. It will be those who are hardest hit who will be again hit by the crime wave as it starts to grow.
The what we see at our end, Caroline, is that I do a lot of refinancing for people post or during divorce, post-divorce, that type of thing there. So definitely banks tightened up. There's more and more bank of mum and dad coming in. If you want to know with that statistically, that is the 6th largest bank in Australia.
Yeah.
Banks are being creative around that, but definitely the lending criteria is really, really tightened. Now, just to fill you in on that, if you're a small business owner, you could be have a harder time, and your business had $250,000 profit a year. It's harder for you to borrow than someone on a $50,000 wage. The way that the banks do that now, a lot of part-time people, particularly women that we see, Caroline, are not in that position. So they're extremely disadvantaged where they've come from a family home and they've had to carve up their assets for a divorce. They take some money to refinance. They might have up to 50% LVR or deposit, just to translate that, but still a bank won't lend to them. And then they're stuck in you raise the rental market. Now I have many of them too that all of a sudden they're in a rental and they're out for whatever reason. The house is sold. When Albo's bringing in 350,000 new people a year, and the construction is about, 50,000 new houses a year. Do that simple maths, right? And if you want to lead into Jim Chalmers and the budget, or Dr. Jim Chalmers, as he's known, So if you want to know about, do you know what he did his doctorate in?
No.
No.
The moods and swings of Paul Keating.
Uh-huh.
Okay, he wants to be known as a doctor, right? And I saw on social media, have you seen a worse one? I said, yes, I've seen, if you remember Wayne Swan,
Yeah.
right? There's that, or as Joe Hockey used to call him, the only rooster in the parliament, and because he goes for the Roosters in Sydney. But I said, no, there's a better one. There was a guy called Mumbles Hayden, Bill Hayden, who actually ran from a press conference when he couldn't articulate what GDP was.
Oh,
Right?
dear.
So we're back in that realm of these treasurers there. And I'm going to switch to another topic about, do they influence Philip Lowe and the RBA? Because interestingly, the RBA Governor Philip Lowe has copped a lot of flack from the union movement and ALP politicians in Parliament. That's nothing new when rates are rising. Okay, you get that. The RBA board usually, and there's been calls by the Labor government to overturn that, turn it into like a C-bus or industry super thing where you've got the likes of Steve Bracks and the others running that show. So the RBA board, they're looking to get rid of the businessmen and put more lay people there, right? Now, the last time lay people sat on a board was the State Bank of South Australia, okay? And that was the biggest banking collapse in the world at that time. And the board was stacked with ex-Labor politicians that had lost their seats, and they had to put, I understand, board papers to the board to explain what interest rates were and that you lent high and borrowed low, which allowed the CEO of the bank to go out and lose $5 billion. Anyway,
Oh my God.
I'll stop there. Enough topics to think about.
Oh my God. I
Right.
do find it phenomenal that you have this call for Philip Lowe and the board. You've got people who have been there, done that. They've been through this. They say this, it's cyclical, right? So they're saying what is worse is to let it become rampant. Let the economy slip away from you. We understand there's pain. We understand people are hurting. But the pain and the hurt will be so much worse if we don't try and rein it in and don't try and control it now. So I would back Philip Lowe every time over, oh God, imagine, people without skill going into those positions. Ruben.
Yes. Can I draw on John's point from a moment ago, because it's an area of interest of mine? There is a disconnect between the interests of the states and the interest of the federal government. Immigration is something obviously under federal control, but housing stock is something that typically remains in the realm of the states. So what's the disconnect there, and how serious is it, and how do we address it?
Yeah, that's a really good point about the housing stock. Don't forget we're in a one-party country, one-party state, in all but two states. Okay, so I don't think they care about the supply as long as they bring in people. My attitude there is more people they bring in, there's more voters for them. That's the rule number one for that.
It increases the value of the housing. Yeah,
so that's fine. Then the number two thing about increasing lots of people, it's actually it's an ugly term for it is called immigration Ponzi scheme. So Australia's pulled that lever many times. So it's unlike any other country. The actual immigrants that we bring in generally actually bring in a lot of wealth. Right? So when you bring in those 300,000 people, often they come, let's say immigration from the subcontinent, it's actually usually quite wealthy people and people from Asia. Very, very, they're not, it's not like Europe or the United States where they're literally coming with the shirts on their back. And then they've got to find housing and employment. The other thing too, these people sort of tend to go into the job market most of them go in the job market straight away. So that's all fine. But the downside of that is there's nowhere to live. Right? So the economically, it's Chalmers will be sitting in his office. They know this well. And the other Liberal Party's done this too. They pull that immigration lever as a quick fix, and it props up the economy. The economy has been running a lot on government, or the state governments, especially in Victoria, of course, is just running on an empty tank of debt and government expenditure. You look at jobs advertised around the country, and almost any, believe it or not, almost anything in Victoria is government related. If you want something project, finance, or IT, you go to Sydney or Brisbane. Go to education now, you go to Sydney and Brisbane. So the long-winded answer is that, yeah, there's the more people, housing stock, and that adds to inflation, actually. More people is going to put inflationary pressure on there.
Yeah, and it's been a bit of a cookie jar for the conservative side of politics as well, because by increasing home value, that appeals to the retiree crowd.
Yeah.
Look, we're gonna see it. That's like, I disagree with you, John, what you say with this. I know that's 350,000 immigrants quick fix, but seeing the environment we're in right now, I'm gonna see there's gonna be more problems than anything else, because there's gonna be more shortages of the jobs. So like, where the people's gonna find 350,000 immigrants gonna find the job, right? You know what I mean? When businesses now being put under such a much duress to keep existing workforce, because the prices the cost of living are rising. So 350,000 people from Asia, yeah, maybe it's going to be a quick fix, but I doubt that's going to be a reflection on a good way. I think it's going to be a negative way, because it's going to burden social system even more in the future. Just in contrast, I said what Carlos spoke today, I'll open a conversation. Yesterday I went to the GP for myself to pick up some medicine. Anyway, a GP it's empty. And so I asked my doctor, where's the people? And she says $65 is a lot of much money, Mario, for the people to pay. So you can't have normal, what's it calling, practice, the GP practice with the people, because they can't afford the medicine. So that's enough indication that the economy is slipping away. So
that's
a good point.
An economy under strain will also throw up opportunists,
yes,
but also disruptors. So there's nothing wrong with disruption if it produces a better result for the majority of us. But there are, we could do a whole topic on the impact of what happens in the medical arena, particularly when there's pressure in terms of price and availability. John?
Yeah, look, that Mario's point is a really good point about when you go to GP and there's bulk billing's dropping away. The supply for the GP has gone up in inflation. That's true, right? But this is an opportunity. They can, if they're sitting in the GP, I can get rid of the bad clients by not bulk billing. It's less stress on them, and it's about 40% more revenue for a fee-paying client. So that's why they do it. So when you talk about opportunists, right, it's just that they're well, this is good, I'll cover my costs. But that's spread everywhere. Lawyers are doing it. I've noticed because there's more people and more demand for these services, professional services are pretty much booked out everywhere. So accountants, solicitors, and on the medical profession specialists, they're all booked out because of the flood of people. And this is what happens. This is like a bit of a Brazil. And, I always talk about Australia going down the Venezuelan road, but you have money. People with money get medical treatment, and you're getting that. It'll shift to private health. That's already shifted years ago. If you want elective surgery, you've got to have private health and spend that money. But these are the consequences. I said there's an upside for Mario that both sides of politics love the short-term fix of 350,000 people, right? One side likes it for voters, the other tends to like it for the cash flow, right? And then you become dependent on it. So that the education industry, which is the largest export was the largest export in Victoria by a country mile, right? They become really, really dependent on it. So why do they want people come here? They want more. The Victorian government, as an example, wants more students to flood the Melbourne CBD. Pandemic comes along, they come back, but they go to Sydney and Brisbane because they don't get locked down again. Then you've got situations in Victoria. This is what happens at the end of it. To use Caroline's term, the boondocks. It's not a suburb of Sunbury, new suburb of Sunbury, but people are moving there around sort of where we live, we see masses of these houses, zero infrastructure, and I mean a road. The road cannot get in and out. The freeway isn't passable. There is no hospital. We all have to go to Melbourne, as you know.
There's no school.
No school. The school's full. Okay.
There are no professional services yet.
No professional services. But if you go into the CBD, right, you can still get units. Now, what is that? They're being snapped up now. So what does that tell you there? That flow of international students has not come back, but the flood of people coming in want cheap housing, but they don't go into the city. They go out. A lot of new immigrants like the idea of coming to Australia and getting a 4-bedroom house, albeit on 300 square meters these days, but it looks great. So that it's built. The churn of houses that we're seeing is unbelievable, with zero infrastructure.
Yeah, it is appalling. So Sally Capp, when she was talking about isn't Melbourne great, you can see all the students have come back. You think that's a bit of a reach, John?
Sorry,
you think that was a bit of a reach by Sally Capp?
I did a large assignment for the University of Sydney in 2018, so I had a really good close look at the fee income and what's supportive and whatnot. One of the things that the cities have different sources of immigration. So Sydney relied very heavily on the Chinese market, and Melbourne had a heavy reliance on the Indian community from the subcontinent. Melbourne had it all laid in front of them. They had infrastructure, masses of tiny units in the CBD, plus the universities were concentrated all in the Melbourne CBD. Sydney didn't have that advantage, right? So one of the things I worked on Westmead campus at Western Sydney, and that attracts new immigrants that are moving 50 k's from the centre of Sydney. The centre of Sydney is now Parramatta, right? That's the geographical population centre. But anyway, another story. But is it a long stretch? Yeah, it is. They've come back from certain areas, but they've just given away the mantle. And at that time, the Asian universities have built their own universities, and Chinese have changed certain criteria for studying abroad. About do you know about that? About online courses and not?
Yeah.
So I agree with you, John. Like, we can just, we don't need to go far away. Like if you're traveling and you, Caroline, when you go back home, just see on airport arrivals, international arrivals. There's no many planes coming anymore in Australia. And as I said, I have opportunity flying last 12 months quite extensively overseas. And I blame a lot of mainstream media in Australia who try to portray Australia is booming and growing and everything else. Overseas people have no interest in Australia anymore, particularly because they are relating what's happening in Victoria during the lockdown. And all they're talking about, when I'm talking to people talking about police in Australia, I say, no, that's a Melbourne. Secondly, Sydney, Sydney beaches, they're empty. There's no tourists whatsoever. I mean, people used to be flocking in Australia to come in during the summer. We're coming into winter now, autumn, winter. Nobody's coming to Australia anymore. And the government doesn't see this as an issue, as a problem. There's no economy, because there's no tourism, money doesn't flowing, and people are, as John says, going further and further from CBD into the rural areas with the cheaper, affordable, and the less stress for everybody. That's a Sydney as well.
So maybe we need to throw another shrimp on the barbie and try and get those tourists to come back. But of course, after the world's opened up again after COVID, people, I think, are making different travel choices. And that terrible phrase that Alan Joyce coined about revenge travel, I thought, you don't even understand it, mate. You have no idea why people are traveling now. And people are traveling for connection. They're traveling to go back to family. They're traveling to see loved ones. It's not revenge travel. I'm so annoyed about that. So Australia is the playground, which of course is one of our economic levers and a very important one, as Mario said, and the government seems to be asleep at that wheel. I agree. It's not back. I know people in the industry, and they thought after COVID, they thought everybody would be busting to come back, but they're not.
Don't forget, this is where inflation kicks in. The cost of an airfare to Australia, all right, if you're booking to go to the old Europe, old Europe,
Yeah,
let alone new Europe. So it's a good 4 or 5 grand.
Yeah.
You might get cheaper flights. Yeah, but it's really expensive. But if you're in Europe still, you can still jump on Ryanair,
Yeah,
and go to Mallorca or somewhere for £50 or something like that. So, and that's the case with our biggest market, Asian travellers. So the Chinese are coming back in dribs and drabs. Japanese can't be bothered. There's a big the missed the boat with Indian tourism. So I believe Indian, like somewhere like Phuket. We even missed the exodus of Russians fleeing the draft. I read where they've absolutely flocked to Thailand and Bali, the ones with money, throughout Asia, and they can get longer visas, but they gave this place a miss.
Yeah, following on from that, I had a member of family go and visit in Bali just a couple of weeks ago, and he was remarking that it's almost like a mini Russia there, that it's just so dominated by Russian people moving in and out on a weekly basis, which is probably a reflection of their visa conditions, and pointing out that there seemed to be a lot of wealth floating around. Now, that's great for Bali, but like you said, John, pity we missed out.
Absolutely, Ruben. Absolutely. I was in the Middle East and all day since last year, right?
In Dubai, yeah.
Yeah, look, you can just see like Western border is closed, but even that is a false, because the Russians can go in France, Russians can go in other countries, Nordic countries. They are there spending time in the winter. But the problem I have, it's very simple. It's like, please correct me if I'm wrong. We are facing the problem which Australia never faced before, which is a global scale inflation, which is, I believe it's already a recession, but they don't want to admit. And the problem I have, how are they going to sort it out, this problem? How are they going to tackle the problem? The same people who are in a parliament for the last 25 years but never have experience dealing with such a risk. That's my problem. Is the same prime minister is going to India to buy submarines, is going in the US to buy submarines, and everybody's flying with the prime minister of Australia since yesterday, India and then US. But the problem is here in Australia. How are they going to tackle the problem they never tackled before? With what?
Yeah. How can they solve it? I've got an idea. Bring in more people.
And I think on that note, I think John Heron has the last word. Thanks so much, Mario, Ruben, John. I'm Caroline Council. Thank you. Informed.